Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of Becoming a Professional. I'm your host Mangala Prasetia, and I'm joined by my host Danielle Bradley. Riley's behind the scene working the equipment as we're recording from Orlando, Florida. Before we introduce our special guest today, let's go through our usual housekeeping. This episode is brought to you by the international chapter of Beta Alpha Psi. Enormous appreciation for their support. Make sure to sign up for the alumni member network if you haven't already, so we can easily connect and have you all experience the benefits that the network has to offer. And a disclaimer, the opinions in this podcast are our own, and it doesn't reflect the position of Beta Alpha Psi and our respective employers as a whole. So, on today's episode, we have Jeffrey Alderman, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Accreditation Council for Business Schools and Programs, also known as ACBSP. But I've probably talked enough, so over to you, Jeffrey. Can you tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming the President and CEO of the ACBSP?
Sure can, but before I get started with that, I'd like to thank my hosts in the studio here and thank Beta Alpha Psi for the opportunity to be on the podcast. It's an exciting day for me and especially an exciting day for the organization that I help lead, which is the Accreditation Council for Business Schools and Programs, which is a mouthful. So like many similar organizations, we use an acronym, ACBSP, to help differentiate us from our sister organizations throughout the world. It's been my honor and my pleasure to be the President and Chief Executive Officer for ACBSP for about 10 years now, and it certainly has gone quickly. Prior to that, my career has been in nonprofit management. We call ourselves the nonprofit administrators. Among some of my stops included working as the director of the State Bar of Kansas, as well as some other bar associations throughout the country in New Jersey, as well as Detroit. But ACBSP, of course, is a not-for-profit organization. We serve our stakeholders. We do not have shareholders. And we exist to help the business schools that we work with and accredit achieve their greatest potential, as well as the students attending those institutions.
And on that topic of origin story, and thank you for that background, what would you say in terms of your career? Can you give an example or two of those defining moments for you that have shaped you into being the leader that you are today, or that led you on that path to give our viewers a little bit more insight into who you are? Great
question, and happy to do that. You know, for folks that I do that do the same thing that I do for a living, you don't really, at least when I went to college 35 years ago, there wasn't a major in nonprofit management. You sort of end up in nonprofit management through exposure from various people along the way. And my initial exposure to nonprofit work was my father, who is one of my heroes. And my father, ironically enough, was a college basketball coach and a professor at a now defunct institution called Detroit Technological Institute, which is now merged with Lawrence Tech in Michigan, where I'm from. But my dad ran YMCAs for over 30 years. And technically, YMCAs are nonprofit as well. And along the way, when I was an undergraduate student, I worked for my father and was exposed to some of the things that I'm still doing today: budgeting, direct sales in terms of membership recruitment and retention, as well as interacting with members. And a lot of that, did not necessarily come naturally. So in time, I feel I became adept at that, listened to my father in terms of his mentorship, and at some point in time, I decided that might be a good pathway for me in my professional career. You know, it's interesting, I had a double major in college, economics and journalism, and My intent was to write for the Wall Street Journal. This would have been the 80s, and there were a lot going on in terms of the financial scope of the world, and I thought I'd be a great journalist working for the Wall Street Journal, not realizing that that's a very competitive job for a lot of people, and after not even mustering a return contact from the numerous times I applied for jobs, I decided that I should go in a different direction. And my father, and you have to, I'll set it up a little bit. Jobs were a lot harder to find back in the 80s. You were either looking at classified ads, you were subscribing to job opportunity newsletters, or you got referrals from friends and family. And that's what ultimately happened to me. My father would get a nonprofit circular for jobs, and it just so happened that a job at the Detroit Bar Association was looking for a membership assistant, and it was pretty much the same thing that I did at the YMCA. Ah. So I applied for that job, and after a few interviews got that job, and that's how my nonprofit career started, and it continues today, 35 years later.
Wow. On that note, I suppose, like with your exposure to non-for-profits, how did you come about getting to know Beta Alpha Psi specifically?
Yeah, so it's a good question in terms of identifying relationships that ACBSP wants to be a part of. And like any good executive, not that I view AACSB as a competitive force. I really look at them as an augmentative force in what we do and in the same type of market space. But I look to see what they're doing, and I look to see what groups that they work with are doing as well. So I set up, it's not too technically savvy, but I'll set up Google alerts for things that I think would be important. They plug into a separate email inbox for me, and periodically I would go and review that. And about 4 or 5 years into my job, I started getting a lot of identifiers for your 100th anniversary of your founding, of course, right? Which was 2019, just prior to the pandemic. And it was from there I started looking at what you were doing and the types of relationships that you have. And it intrigued me enough to think, you know what, this may be something that our organization may benefit from. And as I was getting ready to reach out to Margie, your executive director in the home office, the pandemic hit. And of course, that changed how we as professionals ran our organizations, and it kind of got placed on the back burner. But be that as it may, I kept thinking about it, kept getting the Google alerts. And in 2023, I decided to reach out to Margie and say, hey, I know that you accept students from AACSB institutions, but I really think that given your scope and the opportunities that you can provide to make the world a better place, I would hope that you would consider, or at least introduce to your board, the opportunity for our students to be accepted in the organization. And she was kind enough to respond back to me, and we, as is most of these email exchanges, have become quite busy. And it wasn't until late last year, still in 2023, that I bumped into President Mark Myring as well as Margie at a CHIA conference on accountancy. CHIA is our accreditor based in Washington, D.C., the Council for Higher Education Accreditation. And we've worked with AICPA, and we're part of the CPA evolution in the change in the exam. And we got invited as stakeholders to that event, as did Margie and Mark. And we crossed paths, and I said, hey, can we start talking in a little bit more defining terms to see if this might be something that your organization would consider, and they were very welcoming, which engendered a lot of not only eagerness but a lot of excitement at the ACBSP home office. Again, I've mentioned in passing to your board and to anyone that is listening, we do have BAP alums on our own board, so they already knew about Beta Alpha Psi, and whenever I mention that, they're like, this is exciting for us, this is something you should try to try to get a collaboration on. So I was fortunate enough to be invited in January for a virtual meeting to the BAP BOD Board of Directors, and got a lot of positive feedback from that. And from there, it's moved us to where we are now on the cusp of what I think is going to be an unbelievably positive and mutually beneficial collaboration between the two organizations.
And on that note, actually, do you mind expanding? You mentioned mutually beneficial for both our organizations. What are some of the outcomes you'd like to see from this partnership?
Yeah, certainly from the ACBSP perspective, our connections as more of a fledgling organization, we've grown exponentially in our 36 years of existence. But it's still only 36 years, and you're at 105, and AACSB is over 100 as well. So we're still the new kids on the block, and we don't have the depth of connections with the business world that you all have, the KPMGs of the world, and the IBMs of the world, and those connections, the groups that you work with, I think will be quite beneficial for our students and for our institutions. Jobs in those respective firms are very competitive, and just like the Wall Street Journal with my aforementioned story. But they're not hiring everybody from Stanford or from North Carolina, Chapel Hill, or from the University of Chicago, because students that graduate from our institutions have gone on to be leaders in their own respect. And I think that's what makes the world great, is the opportunity for anyone who has dedication, commitment, and work ethic to be successful. So initially, I think getting to know the collaborations between the schools, learning from each other's institutions, and as well as the students being introduced to relationships that may better their opportunities post-graduation for work in the business world. So from my perspective, I think those are two of the things that I think we're really thrilled about.
All right, thank you for sharing that. Maybe a question now to you, Danielle. From Beta Alpha Psi's perspective, do you mind, for the benefit of our listeners, sharing a little bit, what BAP would like to see from the outcome?
Yeah, absolutely. Similar to the name of our podcast, Becoming a Professional, the goal of Beta Alpha Psi is to assist with the development of the next set of financial leaders in the profession, and be involved in that transition, be there for support, build those networking opportunities, mentorship. How can we, one, set them up in a way to succeed, but also with what we're seeing in the market, there's a need for financial information professionals, and that's going to continue to change and expand. And so from Beta Alpha Psi's perspective, we're really looking forward to this collaboration to impact more students or get in front of those next business leaders and be able to be more intentional with programming, and how can we further our scope and expansion of our mission statement to truly create and help foster this community for the next cycle of business leaders and professionals. So we're really looking forward to that. And from a collaboration standpoint, programming, getting in front of those students, and to what you mentioned, Jeffrey, the ones that are going to take the initiative and intention is exactly who's great target students and members for our organization. So it's all about being there at the right time and in the right place.
So perhaps, Jeffrey, can you share any success stories that you might have come across, with ACBSP accreditation having positively impacted students?
Absolutely, and it's something we live for. We have 7 standards and associated criteria for each of those standards, all driven under the Malcolm Baldrige Standards of Excellence. And for those that aren't familiar with the Baldrige Standards of Excellence, if I may, I'm going to give a 3-minute primer about that. Malcolm Baldrige was the Secretary of Commerce under Ronald Reagan when President Reagan really was trying to redevelop the United States as a manufacturing superpower. In the early 80s, we had lost our place among the very best of manufacturing countries. It allowed, for instance, cars that were manufactured overseas to come in and steal market share from our big 3 automakers. And Secretary Baldrige was tasked with coming up with standards that would allow manufacturing to reclaim its place among the very elite. And he succeeded, which then translated eventually into ISO 9000 and other quality endeavors. And our standards are based on the academic perspective of those same Baldrige standards that have been extrapolated from manufacturing. So what we try to do with our standards is touch upon all the organizational points within a business school with the outcomes that will help students in the long run. So when you ask that question about examples, I have one example on each side. Of course, one for institutions, which are members, and one for students. For institutions, we've received a lot of great feedback and a lot of great letters, but not too long ago, with the school that shall not be named, they had about a 70% decrease in the enrollment that they had in their business school. They were unorganized. They had lost a lot of their faculty, and their curriculum was under review by their regional, now institutional accreditor. And they had someone who championed ACBSP and felt deep down that if they acquire and go through the purposeful intentionality of getting ACBSP accreditation, that it would change their school. And boy, did it ever. It took them about 3 years to get through the accreditation. It involves things like faculty and student feedback, strategic planning, curriculum evaluation, student focus, and those types of things. And after they became accredited, they tripled the amount of enrollees that they had in their institution. Their faculty were more fulfilled. They were staying longer and looking at ways to bring in more faculty. And the president of the university saw this happening and then put more resources into the business unit, as we call it, because they're not all business schools. They may be institutes, school of business, departments of business, into the business unit. And they sent us the greatest letter that we could have ever had in terms of testimonial. You saved our business unit. Wow. And those are the types of things that make us feel good about what we do. On the student side, it's about preparing students without them not necessarily understanding how you're doing it. Our core component, our CPC, is standard 4, and it requires students in the business unit to take an incoming and an outbound examination. So let's just use me as an example. Jeffrey Alderman is an inbound student for the BBA program as a junior. He takes a knowledge-based test on business, and he gets a 69 out of 100. He has his 2 years, and he gets a 4.0. He graduates close to the top of his class. He gets his BBA, and he takes that outbound exam, and he gets a 70. Well, you know what that told us? He didn't learn anything while he was in the business unit. All he did was learn how to get grades and how to recite back to the professors what he needed to do. And that's not helpful when you enter the workforce, because it's exposed quite early on in a tenure at a new job opportunity. So what a school will do is we don't tell them what their curriculum needs to be, but we show them through that test how to improve their curriculum. By improving their curriculum and the quality of the courses that they are teaching students, it makes the students better prepared to enter the workforce without them even knowing. And we have a lot of students' success stories when they come back to their institutions. Now, students in general don't understand what accreditation means. Either do their parents. It's something that's sort of hidden beneath the skin. You certainly want to go to an institution that has been granted the authority to present degrees, to bestow degrees, and then you want to go to an accredited business unit, or you want to go to an accredited nursing program, or in a prior life, what I was doing was accrediting law schools. But what we do with accreditation benefits the student in so many ways, preparing them for the workforce. And when they return back to school as alumni and share stories about, I got this job, I've been promoted 3 times, and those types of great stories, I wouldn't say that ACBSP is fully responsible for that, but we'd like to have just a little piece of that in terms of their success and the development of the curriculum that helped them upon graduation.
Yeah,
it's such an interesting concept, the pre and post. And I think even in the workforce, that's one thing I do with clients all the time. I'll do kind of an entry meeting, as well as after we complete an engagement, where are we, like a check-in, where you truly see that value, one, not only between communication, but the methodologies, how are you engaging in process, what can you do to improve. It does give you a lot of valuable insight, and sometimes it's easier just to continue as is, or follow the same processes and procedures that have previously been established. And in line with that, could you speak on how you feel in the profession in general for young professionals in that transition following accreditation or getting their certificate, their degree, when they're in the workforce, whether it's, finance, accounting, data technology, analytics, any of those options, how you think we can better support them at that level as well?
Well, I'll start with the dynamic change in what young professionals are dealing with what I did when I came out of the business school years ago. When you graduated with your business degree and you were hired, it was incumbent upon you to stay with the firm a certain amount of years to be promoted, to be recognized, and to grow your personal circumstances. And, no one, if they've got a great job out of college, would have thought of leaving it before year 10. That was just the reality of it. My first year out of college was 10 years before I left. Of course, that has changed dramatically now, and you may, as a young professional, have 3 jobs before that 10-year post-graduation date arrives, and that's one thing that we're aware of in the industry, is how to prepare students for the ever-changing evolution of what it takes to be a professional. And certainly nowadays you need to be a generalist. Back in the 80s and 90s, perhaps as far back as the 60s and 70s, you were specific siloed on one thing, and that was what made you great. You were great at one thing. But nowadays, I think young people in general, or those that may not be so young but are in the workforce in a different profession, lane changers, so to speak, need to be aware of the circumstances of what jobs are going to entail. So that's where the quality assurance that the Baldrige principles come in, because it teaches you about the general understanding of businesses, and it's something that we focus on a lot. For young professionals, I think it's critical, and we may get into this later on, but if I talk my way through time today, I want to make sure I talk about this. I think the most important thing for young professionals today, along with their work ethic, dedication, and understanding fit within an organization, is finding the right mentor. I think more than anything else in life is about finding the right mentor and someone that is going to care for you and show you how to succeed in an ever complex workplace. I've had 3 mentors along the way. The first being my father, and then 2 along the way, particularly at my first job, and then at my last job working in the legal profession. But I think finding a mentor and asking them a lot of what they did to grow is important. And the second part of that, in addition to being a mentor, and I digress, but it's purposeful when I say about this, is becoming involved. And one of the reasons that I like Beta Alpha Psi so much is the community service perspective, which I think is changing. We are becoming more and more a bottom line society. Stock buybacks, growing stock price, growing our own personal comp has become paramount to everything that we do in life. Well, I've got news for people. If you're not happy making X, you won't be happy making X to the third power. And a lot of your personal satisfaction will come from giving of yourself to things that are important to you. And we talk about that with the 3 Ps. But I think that more than any other thing is important. So mentorship is very important for young people from my perspective. And then, of course, understanding the value of giving back to the community, I think, is the second part of personal fulfillment and success. You never know, by the way, who you're going to meet when you volunteer at things. You might find your next job out of those relationships, and those things are going by the wayside. In the legal community, it's called pro bono hours, and if you work at a firm, you give so many hours. They've been cut by 33% over the last 10 years. And in the business profession, the same type of thing goes, particularly with income. Like if you're a KPMG and you're a tax accountant, you used to do a lot of complimentary tax returns. And now that's being shifted to the students, to the VITA programs, the voluntary income tax programs that they have at institutions. But those are the 2 things that I think would be beneficial to anyone, young or old, to being successful in their chosen profession.
So I guess on that note, like you mentioned about volunteering, sustainability, like social impact, can you perhaps expand on how students can develop the feelings of I guess empathy, sympathy, that stuff where they want to create a future workplace where it's more meaningful?
Yeah, it's difficult. I'll start with the foundation to get to the answer of the question that you've asked, because we live in an increasingly negative society. Whether it's on the various social media platforms, whether it's talk radio, whether it's the diatribes that come out of politicians' mouth, it's hard to remain positive in the world, much less the United States, when you're dealing with all that. So when we talk about giving back and understanding the value of that, it has to be intentional. It has to be something that has to be planned, and it has to be something that you provide, hours for. One of the things that has helped me, and I have a fancy title of president, but my most favorite title is father and dad and husband. And one of the things that I've tried to teach my children is if you want to achieve something, you need to write it down and be goal focused. And I don't think that is as pervasive as it once was in previous generations. And being intentional about something is successful. Whether it's diet, exercise, faith, anything that you want to do, you have to be intentional about it. It's so easy, and I certainly am not immune to this, but to get on your phone, be locked in your phone, and 2 hours have gone by, and you're like, oh my goodness, what happened to the evening? Set that phone down and look at opportunities. 2 nights ago, I serve on a variety of boards, but this happened to be a camp board that I serve on, of which I'm the treasurer and reviewing the audit. And that was my evening, 3 hours of going through that. And, when I walked out of that meeting, which was virtual, I felt so good about what I had done that had I been on my phone looking at Twitter or X or whatever it's called these days, or Facebook or those things, which I think are important, but everything in moderation. So, to circle back to the original intent of the question, you have to be intentional. If you want to succeed at anything, and the same goes with finding your calling. If you want a job, well, then you have to find a way. What is necessary to get that job? What are the things that I have to do? Whether it's a different degree, whether it's an internship, whether it's a mentorship, or even volunteering. I have seen a lot of people volunteer their way into jobs, by the way, particularly in my career. At various points, I was involved in tourism and worked with the NCAA and with bowl games and that type of things. And there's a lot of volunteers walking around the stadium or on the sidelines, and they work their way into opportunities just by being a part of it. Same thing with college athletics, being a grad assistant or something like that. So I think that there's an important part of understanding the value of walking your way into positions but not being paid during that way to get to it.
Almost the concept of being active and intentional, but being there for an opportunity, and it doesn't need to be something where you're getting compensated or you're expecting something.
You just went back to my earlier point about being happy with how much you make, and making more money is not a crime or a sin or a bad thing, but again, it's so unfulfilling at certain part of time. I like to digress because I spend a lot of time. My wife says I have my own unpaid think tank, right? There are think tanks that exist in Washington, D.C. where people pay a lot of money for people to think for them. Well, I like to think for myself and others. I just don't get paid for it. Yeah. But when I think about things, and it's not all about my family or what I do for a living, I think about ways that I can be more purposeful in what I do. And if you want to achieve it, you got to believe it. And I've said that a lot of times with students that are looking for their dream job. I got my dream job. If I retired today or decided to take a different route in my profession prior to retirement, I would be happy with what I've achieved. I'm not so sure everyone feels that these days, and so what I suggest to people is, if you believe, you shall achieve, but you got to work at it. So that's part of what the accreditation does in terms of the intentionality of what we're requiring schools to do, which then back the student as they get closer and closer to the workforce.
And on the topic of change, you mentioned obviously the landscape in the business practice is changed significantly. So as we focus on being intentional, that we have the concepts of AI, data analytics, there's ever-changing technology, the concept of the phone being so easily accessible with applications. How would you recommend that we integrate more of those foundational elements, or the concept, I guess, of change in general into how we're teaching or the programs that would be applicable for universities?
Absolutely. And that is a tremendous question, particularly as it applies to higher education. Change is inevitable, and you have to accept change whether you want to or not. We, as a culture, are very routine driven, so change does not come easy to any of us. Irrespective of whether we're 5 years old or 95 years old, nobody likes change very much, or very few of us like change. Higher education is facing a crossroads, by the way. We are about to face an enrollment cliff that will see a 30% reduction in the amount of traditionally aged students, 18 to 24, available to enroll in undergraduate programs. That's in part, maybe not in part, maybe for the most part, because of the reduction in the size of families in the United States through family planning. We, as a society, have gone from over 2.5 children per family to a little bit less than 2 per family right now. And when you do that, extrapolate that over millions of people, you can see the reduction. So a lot of schools are going to struggle. In fact, some of the schools that I've seen, not necessarily ACBSP schools, but perhaps some, have closed their doors permanently. A very famous school that is where I used to live in Philadelphia, the University for the Arts, which has probably over 50 Tony winners among their graduates, just closed their doors this past June, and it leaves students scrambling to find out where they're going to be. But higher education has always had a glacial pace of decision making, which is why they're in for a reckoning during this enrollment cliff. They were very slow. At least some professors and some business units were slow to accept hybrid teaching modules where you could virtual teach, go in person, or both. That was a change that they didn't accept. They've accepted it now. I remember schools 20 years ago saying, this school will never offer an online course. Well, how's that working out if you didn't offer an online school? You'd be out of business, right? Everybody offers them now. Same thing with hybrid learning. But to get back to the original question, AI is something we have to embrace. You cannot run from AI. It is going to be exceedingly more difficult for us to not accept that AI is going to change all of our life and perhaps our livelihoods in what we do. Now, I'm not saying that someone has to go and understand coding and understand how AI works, but certainly familiarizing yourself and becoming more welcoming of it, I think, would be helpful in terms of your job and your success. The same goes for higher education. There's a good, not everything is negative about AI. There's, the purpose that they have of helping medical transcriptionists, taking files from paper and through technology, making them digital, helping, at least not this week, with the crowd strike breakdown, but helping airlines run better. Businesses will run better with AI. I don't necessarily think it's going to take jobs away. I think it will help, although the pressure will be to be even more productive, right? If you've got AI walking side by side with you, there'll be an expectation that you need to be better at it. So I think becoming familiar with certain aspects of technology is something that all of us have to embrace, but particularly newer employees, as they understand how the dynamics of the marketplace is going to change. We talk about the creation of jobs, and I've said this, heard it, and believe it. Less than 75% of the jobs that will be necessary to run the world 10 years from now don't exist right now. They haven't been created yet, but they're going to be. And we definitely need to flex into that space. So if someone was asking me, what can I do to help grow in a technology sector, be understanding more of AI, research it, see how it impacts your job, and make it an important part of your day-to-day activities with coworkers, or if you're a sole practitioner and entrepreneur, how it can improve your business. So I think it's not only here to stay, but I think it's going to revolutionize business.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've talked about AI, and then we spoke about social impact. Like, these are the kind of like core skills like that are probably moving forward the students kind of need to develop. You touched on before, like, finding a mentor, but what are some of the other avenues you think that students can pursue to kind of find these, I guess, the intersectionality, right? Like the cross-skilling, opportunities. Like, how do you think that they can expose themselves to the interdisciplinary learning?
Well, networking is an important part of that. I don't know that I see as much of that either. Our societal values and the acceptance of our mobile phone for social outlets has really disrupted face-to-face networking, which is why I'm glad that we are seeing the reintroduction of face-to-face conferences again, because virtual conferences are not as successful, even at a minimal level of face-to-face. So I think that establishing networks of people that you went to school with, of people that you work with, you may meet them at a club, or you may meet them, at various places. But I've always been a joiner, so it's helped me in my career. But networking is important. Awesome. Mentorship is important, as well as spending time outside of work pursuits and perhaps romantic pursuits or family pursuits, in terms of spending time with yourself. I think people are afraid to be alone, or a lot of people are afraid to be alone, and I get some of my best thinking when I'm by myself, which I'll do some tonight when I'm in my hotel room by myself. I won't turn on the TV. I won't look at my phone, and I'll start thinking about some ideas that I may have learned from you today and some of the questions that's being asked. But I think those are an important part of a well-rounded, that's the three-legged stool, so to speak, of personal growth and success. And I stand by it, and I think that concept resonates as much today as it did years ago and into the future. But mentorship is different than networking, and certainly what you're doing and the connections that you have today, sitting side by side in this podcast, had you not been involved in BAP, you wouldn't know each other. And absolutely. That's an example of how you can grow your network.
And talking on networking and relationships growth, the biggest thing that I have seen and what I aspire to do is be continuous with it, right? Like you want to be a continuous learner, focus on continued growth. Can you speak to some of the tips or tricks you would have for those listening, or those that are maybe 4 years in, they're starting to face some of those barriers of whether it's time restrictions, romantic relationships. How can you continue to be intentional with growth and be continuous with that learning, whether it's learning from yourself, as you mentioned, learning from others, or the other pursuits that you'd be engaging in?
The code word is lifelong learners, right? Everyone wants to say they're lifelong learners, and that's fine and good. There are various ways to do that. Going back to school is certainly something about that. exposing yourself to different types of formal writing, books, and I'm not talking fiction. I'm talking nonfiction, autobiographies, those types of things. I think reading is a purposeful and important part of our soul. So I always encourage my kids to read books as much as possible. But the idea of a lifelong learner is be willing to get out of the routine that we spoke about a little bit and try something new. It doesn't necessarily have to be job related or focused, but for instance, I always use myself as an example because it's easy to fall back on that. But I was a competitive cyclist when I was younger, and to this day, still do like to ride a nice sleek bicycle. But I never learned how to fix it. I never took, a bicycle mechanics course. I always just took it in, paid someone to do it, and I thought that's the only way to do it. Not too long ago, I took a training course in mechanics for bicycles, and realized that it wasn't as difficult as I had it, out to be. So, my thought is, to people that think about continuous and learning, I think the biggest thing in life, but the biggest thing as part of your lifelong journey, is don't be intimidated by what you don't know. I think that is the greatest cause of stopping people in their tracks. They are afraid, at least in a group setting, to be embarrassed. They are afraid, one of my greatest embarrassments with my wife was taking dance lessons. Boy, does that expose you to a class if you don't know how to dance. But I think don't be intimidated by things you don't know, and that falls into this lifelong learning thing. And in fact, when I go full circle, that's what accreditation and what we do is all about, because when we recruit schools to ACBSP, and we ask them, the first question is, do you think accreditation might help your business unit? You don't think would it be good for you? The answer 9.9 times out of 10 is yes. No one's going to say, I don't like accreditation. It's not going to be helpful to our school. Well, what's stopping you? Well, they give a litany of explanations or excuses, if you will. We don't have the time. We don't have the expertise. We don't have the faculty level of training. And that I feel a lot of trepidation and the intimidation of doing that. So for students that are listening to this podcast, if you want to take away one important thing, don't let lack of understanding or awareness prevent you from trying something new. You'll be glad you did when you do it.
Wow. No, that's a profound message, I think, for our listeners. I guess casting back, like we're conscious of your time, but like promise only a few more questions. But I want to go back to something that you said earlier in your earlier in our podcast about when you were growing up and like the changes that you're seeing. I guess reflecting on your early career, we've talked about a range of topics, right? AI, sustainability. What were some of the key skills that you had to you felt that you had to prioritize when you were in early career? And then what do you think the students nowadays have to prioritize? Like, does that look different? Is it all still the same?
Well, I think it does look the same to some extent. So, for me, coping was a very difficult skill for me when I entered the workforce. My mother was a perfectionist. I love you, Mom. And, straight A student, valedictorian of not only high school class, but college. Yeah. And that translated to her firstborn son. And I tried to do everything perfectly. If my boss gave me an assignment, I, would work on it, work to the time of paralysis to get it done. Same thing I may have had with, my English papers when I was a J student in university. I keep rewriting it. And after I spent 10 hours on the same paper, I realized it didn't improve much from the original draft. The same thing could be said for people in the workforce coping skills, and to remember that mistakes aren't fatal to your career. I had a boss who I would consider one of my mentors come to my office one day in Detroit when I was working at like 8:30, and he had gone out to dinner with friends, then come back to pick up some things and then go home. He goes, "You still here, Alderman?" And I said, "I'm working to get this done." He goes, "Let me tell you something about what you're doing tonight." He goes, 10 years from now, 5 years from now, probably half a year from now, no one will remember what you were doing in this office at night. But you know who might? Your family, because they didn't see you, and you know, they missed you in doing that. So coping with mistakes, I think, is an important part of being a productive human being, and not worrying about things that you can't control. And even if you made a mistake, you have to let it go. You know, my father, again, going back to the mentor stage, he had a placard over his shop at our home that says, "Success is knowing you've done or tried to do the best of which you are capable." And if you did your best, then you're successful. And that allows me, even when I've had mistakes, and believe me, even with people like titles like mine, president and CEO, we still make mistakes. But if we did the best of which we're capable, then I can put my head down after a long day and know that you know, tomorrow will be a new day. So you know, mistakes aren't fatal, and coping with those feelings of insecurity and you know, someone's not going to like me, or someone's not going to like the work that you're doing. I don't think, I think you embellish that in your own mind. And I think that's a sad thing of, you know, I'm not on TikTok, but I think some of the videos there that they will algorithm into your feed are not positive, perhaps, and they'll feed you the wrong message. I'm not picking on TikTok because everybody loves it, but I think it embellishes the worst things to think about. And I've been to Africa, and we work with a lot of schools in Africa, and as a culture, African people are the happiest in the world, yet they possess the least amount of material possessions. Goes back to my, you know, money's not going to change your life if you don't change your attitude. The same thing goes with coping skills, having that positive attitude. It's a cliche, but I'm telling you, if you wake up in a good mood, you will be in a good mood most of the day. If you want to be in a bad mood, you'll be in a bad mood most of the day, and it will accelerate your problems. You all know this, and you have the opportunity to change this again. And I'm kind of moving a little, you know, away from accreditation and becoming more of a father here, but that's what helps make a good employee. Whether you're working for an accreditation body, whether you're working for KPMG, whether you're working on Wall Street, those are the types of things that are necessary in order to be successful in life. So another takeaway in terms of today's broadcast or podcast, you know, mistakes aren't fatal. Awesome. If you've done the best you're capable of.
And I think that deals a lot with control, like knowing you can't control everything in the world. And that was a hard lesson that I learned professionally, was when I made mistakes, I was very hard on myself, and learning that there's lessons and reasons things do occur.
Do some of these things resonate? Am I
close
to am I close to what you all feel in terms of your thing? They're not just cliches, and trust me, we are our own worst enemy as you know, judges of what we do. And I know you felt it. I've certainly felt it. You felt it. It's something that is inherent with performers. If you're a performer, then you're going to have these things come into your life. That's part of the challenge of being a good student, being a good person, and being, you know, a good employee. But again, moving past that is I think the greatest thing, and your supervisors would tell you as much. if you ask them.
Yeah.
Which is why, I if you ask me this without questions, next month I'd have the same answers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And on that topic, obviously, focus on things in your control. And one thing you can control is networking, which you hit on earlier, whether you're taking advantage of any opportunity and making sure that you're being intentional with time or conversations that you may have. Can you provide just a little bit more in terms of the concept of networking that you think students now could be taking advantage of, or recommendations that you have to maximize those networking opportunities for them?
Yeah, I do know this. My children, all of whom are college graduates, have less friends than I had when I graduated from college. And it's interesting, when I talk to them, they say, well, I've got 2 or 3 people in my friendship group. I said, is that it? They go, well, that's all I've got. I think that making friends is difficult outside of college. It just is. And if you're a hybrid student that's not going in person, it's even more difficult. So I always tell people to be like I said, to be a joiner. Join groups, look for groups to be a part of. You don't have to go to church every Sunday, but there are social groups. But a lot of those groups are going to be found in the volunteerism that we touch base on a little bit, and you'll meet like-minded people that I think will help you establish relationships with things that you do. You have control over everything that you do in life, and networking is a byproduct of effort. So if you don't put any effort into networking, you won't. If you don't put anything into it, you won't take anything out of it. I happen to believe in the power of networking, particularly on the job. I often stopped in departments that I had no business chatting with people about. What do you do here? And, how do you do things? And you'd be surprised when people are talking about themselves or what they do. You can get a lot about, from things in people that you don't. So, the next time you go to work, to the extent you can, why don't you talk with somebody you haven't talked to ever, or not had a serious conversation about? Say, hey, can I take you out to lunch? Bring them a cupcake, compliment them on something. The power of those types of even secondary things are very powerful. My wife, I like to use her as an example because she's in a very difficult work environment. She works in hotels. She's a hotelier. Okay. And, they got people coming and going. They're hiring people. People are quitting. They got, support staff that comes in just for serving, dinners one night and all of that. It's always different. It's always busy. But she makes a point of connecting with a certain segment of the hotel each month, whether it be the housemaids that clean, whether it be the valet drivers, whether it be the people at the front desk, and it connects them to her and her to them, and they do a lot of that. So I always don't stay in your own group, whether it's a practice group or something. You'd be surprised. A kind word can, again, a lot of this feels fatherly, and maybe it is, but I'm telling you, it's not redundant. It's important. I know I'm looking at my watch. I don't want to get out of here, but I want to have one last thing that I think is important. And I'll ask you guys a question. I'm going to flip this
okay.
and end it with this. We have surveyed the Fortune 10,000, the 10,000 highest grossing companies in the world. What are the skills that they've identified as lacking in graduates that they hire from the top institutions, middle, or any, what skills do you think have been identified by the Fortune 10,000?
That's a good question.
I would say, I think to the concept of networking, relationship building, or feeling confident and speaking publicly, I think that's something that I've seen.
Yeah,
It's a positive
networking.
answer, but not an answer that they care about, right? Because it doesn't help the bottom line.
Okay.
Not a bad answer and a good thought. Well, I'm not going to break your brain over this one. It's soft skills, something that you're not necessarily taught in university setting, but the idea of being able to talk with someone one-on-one, the willingness to work in group settings without being assigned, the willing to do kind things, how to write an email with purpose. That's where AI is going to come in. It'll help a lot of people with their writing skills and their communicative skills. Certainly is going to be, but that's the craziest thing about companies. And you've all gotten a taste of it, whether it's at a fast food restaurant or a upscale restaurant, whether it's at a clothing store or whether it's dealing with someone that you called your credit card, because there was a fraudulent charge on there. Those are the skills that I think we are going to embed into some of our desirable curriculums that the Fortune 10,000 want. They want those soft skills. We've gotten away from that, right?
Yeah.
And we need to return to that. And believe it or not, people that have those soft skills are way more productive than people that don't have it. It saves them time. And, I'm saying looking at people when you shake their hand, thanking people in an appropriate way, kindness. I know that seems commonplace, but they wouldn't be saying it if it isn't.
Yeah.
It's impactful.
And the Fortune group told us that. So if you're a student and you're thinking about that, you could jump to the head of the pack if you focus on those other things like soft skills, which is something that I think is vitally important and something that's forgotten in this day and age.
Wow. Well, on that note, thank you so much, Jeffrey. Thank you for joining us on this podcast. And thank you to our listeners for tuning into this week's episode. But we got lots and lots of golden nuggets of advice from you, I think. Like, we've covered a whole circle of topics. But yeah, thank you again. Thank you, Jeffrey, for being on this podcast. To our listeners, be sure to like, subscribe, and follow us from whatever platform you're tuning in from. Also, check out the show notes for our various social media pages and official BAP swag as well. And we'll see, to our listeners, we'll see you on the next episode of Becoming a Professional.
Hi everyone, Danielle here with the credits. This episode, titled A Collaboration for the Future, was hosted by Mangala, Prasetia, and myself, Danielle Bradley. The episode was produced by Riley Ramos and accompanied by our special guest, Jeffrey Alderman. Music was sourced from Resolute Audio and Fine-Tune Music on Adobe Stock. Huge shout out to Beta Alpha Psi for their financial support and keeping the podcast going strong. If you haven't already, please join the Alumni Member Network. Details can be found in the show notes. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you on the next episode of Becoming a Professional.